This is Chapter 7, covering technical presentations. While I know you have already taken a course that involves presentational speaking, this is specific to how those same concepts you learned in your communications class apply for technical presentations. And we'll talk about numerous types of technical presentations you will experience as an engineer. When preparing for your technical presentation, there are 8 key steps that you want to follow. You want to assess your audience, garner their attention, establish credibility, define the unfamiliar, organize logically, practice your delivery, and then summarize. So starting with assessing your audience, when you do an audience analysis, some of the things that you want to be thinking about is who is going to be there and why are they there? What role do they fulfill? What do they already know and what will be familiar? Keep in mind that in larger groups, this will be various across your different constituents, and you need to think, for the most part, what will the main audience or the greatest number of people already know and be unfamiliar with? And that might help you customize your material a little bit to mostly present towards the main group, but then also keep in mind that some other people may not have the same familiarity or may have greater familiarity with concepts that you'll be speaking about. What will they find compelling? What is interesting to them? This is part of why they will be there. What is their motivation for being present? And so what are they most interested in learning? And finally, it's really important to know what you want them to do with the information. Is this giving an update and it's just useful for them to know these ideas? Or are you making a request of some action to be taken? Those are critical differences in how you would prepare and how you would present. When you're thinking about the content itself, the same keys for technical writing apply to your presentation. It should be clear, concise, and correct. You should also think about having kind of 3 different ways to talk about it. A thesis statement, 1 or 2 sentences that summarizes your main idea. This is something that you're going to want to harken back to numerous times throughout your presentation to make sure that individuals have the thread of the presentation. What is the main idea? You'll want to revisit that. The elevator pitch is a 1 to 2 minute summary of your important ideas, and this should come towards the beginning of your presentation so that individuals understand your focus as they approach your presentation. And then when you think of the full presentation, you want to align your content for the selected desired outcome. So if you are presenting for informational purposes, the information and their comprehension of it is the main focus. If you're doing a proposal and you're wanting an approval, you need to consider what your audience requires from you to feel comfortable giving that approval. Or if you're trying to show that your company is the best for a particular bid process, you want to highlight those features of your company that are most appropriate for that particular bid. So think about the content in terms of the desired outcome. It might be that you would have the same content, the same main idea, but you would present it slightly different ways. For example, you might present a project update to your fellow engineers and then do a project update for the executive individuals of the company. Those would not be the same presentation, even though you were having the same basic content. Your focus for your peers might be oriented more towards the technical information, where your focus for your executive levels would be more focused on meeting the desired outcomes of the project or talking about next steps. So your content selection should be based upon the audience and your desired outcome. So to garner their attention, your opening should include some element that really helps to have them deeper engage and connect with you. It should also be related to the content that follows. So the old adage about opening with a joke is not necessarily suitable here for a technical presentation, but it may be helpful to do some sort of anecdote or a brief narrative or a surprising statistic that will help them to tune in to what you're about to say. If you can think about how many people just constantly have their phones with them and maybe a smartwatch that's giving them updates. Our attention is being divided all of the time, and we are constantly being bombarded with additional information. So to capture their attention and have them fully engage with you, it is helpful to have some sort of attention grabber at the beginning of your presentation. It should relate to the content, though. It should not be a standalone piece of information just to kind of jar the audience. You want them to attune themselves to engage with your content. You also want to make sure that they understand your role with this content. In establishing your credibility, this is not about proving authority or highlighting all of your skills, but rather showing how you connect directly to this work and how your experience, your expertise, your role within the company, all put you forward as the appropriate person to be talking about this. Again, the focus is on the content. You're really looking at your role with respect to the material that you are presenting, not necessarily your role within the company, in leadership or management, but rather what is your role to what you are presenting. You want to provide a preview, and I mentioned this before, that kind of 1 to 2 minute summary, because there's something called the primacy effect, meaning that when a very brief overview is provided at the beginning, the audience can mentally track that and remind themselves that. So every time you comment on something that is familiar to what you've already said, they're able to build on that thought and internalize it more deeply, to remember it better. It also helps them to understand the comprehension, the overall theme and goal, and how each section relates to that theme or goal, so that within the presentation, as you move through the different areas, they have an overall idea of how those fit into the greater context of the presentation. Those gentle reminders about your overall theme, as we mentioned in the beginning, that, 1 to 2 sentences, that is the central theme or goal, should be really prevalent all throughout your presentation, because again, that reiteration is helping it to stick with the audience and for them to have that key takeaway. You also want to think, again, by assessing your audience, knowing what they are not going to be familiar with, and you want to think about how the terms that you're using, especially technical jargon, words that are very specific to your company or your field, may not be known by the entire audience. You also want to think about processes or technique that were critical to your work. So if you're referring to a specific manufacturing technique, and you just say milling or turning, and you're talking to a non-technical audience who doesn't understand manufacturing practices, they don't have a good mental picture of what you're referring to as you speak about it. So think about who you're presenting to, and within your industry, within your specific company, or within your specific discipline, terminology and concepts that we take for granted as being universally known may not be as familiar with those outside of your specific area. So to define these, sometimes you can start with an operational definition, describing how something works. This is very important for like processes and techniques, as you can describe how it works. You can also use a logical definition, which kind of creates various categories so that people can take the terms and understand, sequencing or how these are connected to one another. Sometimes terms have an etymological or historical definition it can be helpful or not helpful, depending on how terminology has changed and how it has been used. So again, it's helpful to reaffirm definitions, especially if their meaning has changed over time, so that people understand what it is that you're referring to. You can also define things either by examples or by opposition, which is also kind of an example, but by defining what it is not. So when you talk about 3D printing, you could say this is an additive manufacturing process. So while turning and milling remove material, 3D printing adds material. So you can use examples that they already know, either as a contrast or as a comparison, to help the audience better connect with what you're talking about. You want your flow of the material to have a very logical sequence, which could be either aligned with a process that you approached or the chronological order of the things that you are speaking about. And it's really helpful to have someone else engage with the material before you present, if at all possible, because an outsider's point of view will be the best to help you understand if it makes sense. You also want to know if your logical organization ends in a place of action for the audience. Do they understand what they were supposed to gain from this presentation? Did they learn the main idea? Do they know how it applies or how it is relevant to them? Have you posed a question for them to consider? Or are you proposing a next step? Make sure your organization places you in a position where they are continuously hearing the main theme, but then also know what the next steps or what's being required of them at the end of the presentation. For the delivery, this is probably one of the most difficult parts for individuals who are not comfortable with public speaking, because you want to hold a balance of being both polished but also flexible. Meaning you want to be well prepared and confident, but you don't want to be memorized and just reciting without taking indications from the audience of to what you might need to do to better connect. You also don't want to be reading a script word for word, and certainly not reading the slides word for word, but rather engaging with the audience. It's actually one of the reasons that Zoom is so difficult when you're doing lectures like I am right now. I don't have any access for you for some of the nonverbal cues to know how you're engaging with this material. I can't look at you, your body language, your facial expressions. I can't see if you're distracted and if you're staring at your phone, or maybe you have this running in the background while you watch something on your phone or playing a video game. But when you're in a live presentation, you'll be able to see your audience to expect nonverbal cues to help you know if they're confused and might need additional explanation, or if they seem like they're disengaging and you might need to adjust your pacing or your speaking style. It's also important to note for your delivery that you need to maintain both a level of confidence but also interest. This work should be important to you. If you aren't interested, they definitely won't be. And those types of things they can gather as nonverbal indicators as you present. The audience is looking at your nonverbals, and if you seem disinterested or perhaps timid, it can diminish your credibility, and it can also cause them to disengage with your material. Before you hit your conclusion, you do want to make sure that you summarize the main points because of the recency effect. So as we talked about the primacy effect in the beginning, the recency effect means that you can harken back to many of the main concepts of your presentation, and they will be fresh in your audience's head, and you can once again show a common thread through each of those topics, bringing you to your conclusion. This helps to give you an opportunity to reiterate the why. Why are you presenting in the first place? Why are they there to hear you present? By reiterating the focus of your presentation, you can then prepare them for what I call the ask, which is what comes next. What do they need to do? What should they have learned? So if it's a case of them understanding a new concept, you might want to pose a question to say, do you now understand X, Y, or Z? How does that relate to your specific interest or field? Or if you're asking them to take an action, it should be very clear what that action is and how it related to the material that you presented. Like, for example, if you are making a proposal for a project, the audience should understand what the project includes and what benefits they will gain, and what they're being asked to do in support of your project. Those are all key things that should be consistent throughout the presentation, summarized, and then end with what is expected of the audience. So for types of presentations, there are basically two categories, informal and formal. And I'm going to mention academic informal and formal in addition to professional, because as engineering students, you are also doing presentations on a fairly regular basis. For the informal, we have small group meetings or project updates, staff meetings. These are things that happen on a regular basis with a limited group of people. And oftentimes conversations are very casual. and can have a lot of engagement between the participants. For formal presentations, you're looking at larger group meetings, executive level presentations, and especially external customer presentations. So those formal meetings do not necessarily have synchronous feedback, but rather you would be presenting fully before receiving questions, which is also true of academic presentations. Now, for your informal presentations in a professional realm, oftentimes the individuals that are with you have a shared subject matter expertise, which means you do not have to be as concerned about some of the technical jargon or defining all of your terms. It also means that you'll be receiving synchronous feedback and questions throughout the entire presentation itself. You should be prepared to receive constructive feedback because in these informal settings, the questions that they ask and clarification that they need, it might become clear to you that you didn't necessarily prepare it in a way that made sense to all of the participants. Or they might have different ideas on how you might proceed or what the next steps might be. So that type of synchronous feedback does open itself up for some constructive feedback and even potentially some constructive criticism. On the academic side, you can think about when you present your project work to peers or professors or industry members. Now, depending on what the setting is, this might feel more formal if you're presenting to professors in industry, but oftentimes they're in internships and projects, you're often meeting with individuals, giving updates along the way. And from an academic standpoint, most of the time, even in a co-op or internship, those that you're working with understand that there's a learning process as well as the results. And so your academic presentations differ slightly because you're actually showing the process of how you gained the information, not just the outcome that was gained throughout the process. Again, you should expect to receive constructive feedback from those individuals on what your next steps might be and what you can improve upon in your own presentational skills. For formal presentations in a professional world, oftentimes with executive and external customers, it's expected that you would have some sort of ask of what comes next from them. So what are you doing and how are they fitting into that picture? Are they needing to approve it? Are they needing to provide funding for that? Are you expecting them to accept a bid or work with you as a client or as a customer? So you need to make sure that you're very clear on what that ask is. You should offer an opportunity to clarify points as required, although again, for formal technical presentations, that will typically be at the end. And you want to make sure that you are connecting how your technical presentation is a positive for them. And in your demeanor, you want to make sure that you're fostering positive interactions because the positive interactions with your audience often leads to positive outcomes. People feel more inclined to work with individuals that they feel that they have clarity in what's being done and a confidence of how they're going to do it. From an academic standpoint, such as a conference presentation, you are often considered the subject matter expert, but so are the peers. Oftentimes people at conferences are there surrounding a specific discipline, which means there can be an increase in technical jargon as you see as appropriate. But it's still important to establish your credibility. What training and learning and experiences have brought you to the point that you can stand in front of your peers as a subject matter expert and inform them about your work? So that covers the main areas of presentations. And in this course, you will have an opportunity to continue with a presentation yourself. Those are some things to think about of how you will structure your material, deliver your material, and what your focus should be on as you are crafting your content.